In the Lyman direction, Russian forces are trying around the clock to break through the Ukrainian defenses, operating in small infantry groups and actively using drones. This was reported by the 66th Separate Mechanized Brigade named after Prince Mstislav the Brave. Russian soldiers move in groups of 2 and attempt to attack from different directions at the same time. The enemy also uses motorcycles and passenger cars, but rarely brings in armored vehicles. The reason is the difficulty of moving them across natural barriers, particularly the Kornyi Zarabets River.
At night, they try to bring in reinforcements, maneuver around us, and build up their forces, and during the day, they launch assaults. That's why we have to conduct not only defensive battles, but also strike and search operations to destroy their concentrations. At the same time, while the assaults continue, the enemy tries to bring in new forces. For this reason, a single assault attack can consist of several such waves. There can even be up to a dozen assault waves during a single offensive. Vasily Denisyuk, serviceman of the 66th Separate Mechanized Brigade named after Prince Mstislav the Brave.
In the Lyman direction, the Russian army attacked in the areas of the settlements of Karpivka, Redkadub, Kalodyazy, and Hryhorivka. On the Siversk section of the front, the enemy carried out assault operations near Hryhorivka and Peryazn. The Russians also tried to advance toward Fedorivka. And in the Pokrovsk direction, clashes were recorded near Vladimirovka, Nikanarivka, Fedorivka, Myrolubivka, Kotline, and Myrnorad.
The enemy has chosen a systematic tactic carrying out attacks in the central directions. These are Pokrovsk, Lyman, Novopavlivsk, and to some extent, Sumy and Zaporizhia regions. And they continue to do so. Right now, there's a kind of shifting, active engagement going on, but it's very telling that we have driven out all the enemy forces from the direction of Dobropilya, Kostantinivka, and the highway they were controlling. Yes, right now, their firepower can still reach Dobropilya and Kostantinivka, but there are no longer any enemy troops or other enemy assets physically present there.
The Russians are increasing pressure in the north of Donetsk region. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi, following a working visit to the units defending those areas. He also said that he spoke with brigade and corps commanders to get the most detailed and objective information possible about the situation on the battlefield.
The hottest spots remain the Pokrovsk, Dobropilya, and Novopavlivka directions. In addition, the enemy is increasing pressure in the north of Donetsk region. In the Lyman direction, our units are engaged in heavy defensive battles against superior Russian forces, holding back their assaults and, in some areas, carrying out active counteractions. The armed forces are aware of their great mission and their ability to continue fulfilling the tasks set before them. Oleksandr Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Telegram.
The warriors of the Spartan Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine discovered enemy shelters and ammunition depots in the Pokrovsk direction. UAV operators engaged the targets. One of the Russian soldiers tried to put out the fire with a rag, but realizing it wasn't working, decided to hide under it, in vain, however. Ukrainian drones got him too. Meanwhile, fighters from the 5th Assault Kiev Brigade inflicted significant losses on the Russians in the Kramatorsk direction. Thanks to precise drone strikes, a tank was hit, and a quad bike, an artillery piece, and Russian infantry personnel were destroyed. In the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 920 Russian occupiers. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has lost more than 1,072,000 soldiers. In addition, yesterday Ukrainian defenders struck 50 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher, 1 tank, and 4 armored combat vehicles. 142 units of enemy vehicles and special equipment were also destroyed.
Nikolai Malamaz, General of the Ukrainian Army and head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine from 2005 to 2010, is joining our broadcast. We'll discuss the situation on various parts of the front with him. Nikolai Grigorievich, welcome. Glory to Ukraine.
Good morning.
Greetings. Glory to the heroes.
Nikolai Grigorievich, what should we understand right now about the situation around Pokrovsk, yes? And taking into account the information that was available earlier, right? We recorded certain attempts by the enemy to break through, and of course, the deployment of additional Ukrainian armed forces units to contain this breakthrough and eliminate possible threats that such actions opened up for the enemy.
Well, the enemy has chosen a systematic tactic, carrying out attacks in strategic directions. These are Pokrovsk, Lyman, Novopavlivsk, and partly Sumy and Zaporizhia regions. And they continue to do so. But the relevance of especially offensive operations in the Pokrovsk direction was during the period of negotiations between Trump and Putin, and accordingly, our president together with European leaders in the US. That's why the activity was especially high, and we see that the enemy tried to deploy large contingents. We see that not only mobilized troops and new units were brought in, but also airborne assault forces and the marine infantry. And that's why the breakthrough in the direction of Dobropilya brought about a new tactic. On one hand, there was an increase in forces and resources, and on the other hand, infiltration, advancement by small saboteur groups, seizing positions, and then reinforcing those positions with other units and further advancing toward Kostiantynivka, with the goal of capturing the entire Donetsk region. This is a large-scale strategic operation. I want to emphasize that in terms of its scale, it did not succeed. Yes, at some point we did have some coordination issues between our troops. They managed to break through, but we quickly got a handle on the situation. Commander Syrskyi personally went to those areas, and 2 airborne brigades were quickly prepared and actively joined the fight. And accordingly, the Azov Corps systematically joined in to contain these breakthroughs. And of course, counterattacks began. The strikes were carried out very skillfully. I want to highlight that. Flanking attacks were launched. There was clearing of individual settlements both from the front and in a frontal format. But at the same time, these groups that were gathering for new attacks were destroyed by firepower. This made it possible to liberate 6 settlements. It was a very successful operation, and we actually disrupted Putin's strategy, not just to seize new territories and claim the Donetsk region under the pretext that he was already taking it. The only question was when it would happen, so he demanded it be handed over voluntarily. That didn't work. It was a punch right in the gut. This is a very strong approach that allowed us, in tough and far from easy battles, to hold our positions. Right now, there's a kind of ongoing, active work happening. But it's very telling that we drove out all the enemy troops from the direction of Dobropilya, Kostiantynivka, and the roads they used to control. Yes, their firepower can still reach Dobropilya and Kostiantynivka, but there are no longer any enemy troops or other enemy assets physically present there. The second component is Pokrovsk. We systematically cleared it of sabotage groups. They had broken through to the outskirts of Pokrovsk in several places. This wasn't just of military significance, but also political. Because Putin was pointing at the map to Trump and saying, "See, Pokrovsk is already captured. Kostiantynivka is already captured." So all of this was shown to Zelensky when they displayed the map during the Ukrainian president's visit to the White House. That's it. But it turned out to be fake. We presented maps from satellite intelligence, technical sources, deep state, videos, and other monitoring tools, so to speak. And Trump realized that things weren't so clear-cut. And this large army, as he told our president, is big and ready to advance, while our side is not making any real progress. There have been some isolated advances, but we carried out a counterattack. And the Pokrovsk direction was key, both from a military standpoint, in terms of neutralizing the breakthrough, and politically, for conducting negotiations. Of course, the enemy continues to launch new attacks, trying to prove a point. That is, even during the negotiation period, during the supposed preparations for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, you think the tension would be eased and such attacks wouldn't happen. On the contrary, Putin chose a tactic of refusing any ceasefire, and to keep pressing further. Pressing us so that we would supposedly have a weak position. But we can see that we do not have a weak position. Yes, there are certain areas, like Serebryansk, where they enter the forest. We are engaged in heavy fighting there over the past day, but there has been no effective advance. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, in Volskoy, they also tried to break through. We maneuvered and pulled back, but now we are hitting those troops with barrages of fire. But near Sumy, on the other hand, there have been several very effective counterattacks. And there, not only did they halt the offensive, they pulled back and are even moving units from there to Pokrovsk and other areas to reinforce their positions, because there's no prospect for them in Sumy. And of course, the sore spot is Kursk and the Kursk salient. This is a topic that has always irritated Putin. That's right. But as for, it's impossible to capture the bridgehead. And here we have, as Trump would say, some real trump cards. We're holding a bridgehead on Russian soil. And this is a very powerful way to destroy the reserves they're now pulling in there. And we have good positions. And accordingly, also in political terms, in terms of bargaining. So at this moment, this is a very significant point. I think we'll keep holding our position so that, when negotiations come and there are some movements regarding the territories, we won't give anything up. But this particular area could be used as a bargaining chip for the liberation of certain territories in a peace agreement. That's it. And of course, there are also some very tactical problems. But there's also the Lyman sector, where they keep trying to advance, but it's not working out for them, sort of alternative strike sectors. Well, increasing the number of attacks and the possibility of infiltration. This is an old tactic, we already know it, and we destroy them. Of course, the enemy can't make any systematic progress. There are small advances of a few hundred meters. We counterattack and also enter there, so to speak, sectors where they had taken positions. This is a back and forth combat situation. So overall, if we look at it, yes, there are heavy battles, but we are holding the front. Most importantly, the Pokrovsk direction has been stabilized overall. However, this is not a final resolution yet, because the enemy is ramping up its efforts and once again deploying new means to weaken our positions. But we already have a second echelon holding the line and carrying out effective work. On the Novopavlivka direction, which we haven't mentioned yet, there are also ongoing battles. The enemy is also periodically trying to advance here, aiming to encircle the Pokrovsk sector and the groupings present there. But we have long since mastered the model of holding them back and launching counterattacks there, as well as preventing them from advancing both into the Pokrovsk sector and into the Dnipropetrovsk region, where they are also trying to push forward from the same sector. He is currently failing not only militarily, but also in terms of motivating Putin, meaning he hasn't managed to seize another territory that could be used as a bargaining chip. That's just not happening. We are defending. They tried to enter the border of this region several times, but we drove them out. And we continue this work. I believe the enemy has no prospects for tactical, let alone strategic, offensives. And now we're talking about our prospects, that in the course of negotiations, not only with Trump but possibly with Putin as well, it will become clear that Putin has no chance of winning. And military solutions, so to speak, will not outweigh political ones. We are holding the front and strengthening our positions. There may even be a prospect of devaluing the enemy, since their resources are limited. We see every day that up to 1,000 or more are eliminated. That's a significant number of enemy combat units destroyed. It's very difficult for them to replenish those numbers. That's why the factor of our defenders, the active destruction of the enemy's reserves, and holding the front. These are some of our main trump cards in the negotiation process and in the strategy for a future peace.
Nikolai Grigorievich, if we also look at the political aspect in the context we're in now, the numbers given by the General Staff aren't any different from what they were before all these consultations and negotiations began. So, apparently, the enemy is sticking to exactly the same tactics as before and continues to do so. And basically, all of this gives the impression that we're seeing something similar to what happened before the start of the full-scale invasion, when the enemy tried to seize as many advantageous positions and capture as much territory as possible, maybe to use it for further breakthroughs after some kind of lull. So, if we look at the situation on the front from this perspective, could it be that the Kremlin has such plans?
Well, the most important component is, yes, they really want to take positions that are very convenient for attacks, cut off our logistics routes, destroy our infrastructure and energy facilities so that we can't effectively supply our troops. And of course, as part of the bargaining, they raised the issue that we should, so to speak, exchange territories, that they will stop firing in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions if we give them the Donetsk region. This is a very cunning, strategic idea. Even Trump is buying into it, but especially Vitkov. He says, yes, let's do it. You give it up, and the war will end. There will be peace. I'll say it straight, hundreds of times. Putin in various formats. And before Putin, other Russian leaders as well. They promise, they sign peace agreements or ceasefires. And then, after building up their resources and waiting for a more favorable situation, they would start attacking again. If we, just theoretically, were to give up the entire Donetsk region, and there we have 60 kilometers of powerful fortifications and hundreds of tactical structures. Basically, they would take over those positions, have a strong foothold against our counterattacks, and most importantly, There's nothing behind them. It would be an open field for the enemy's strategic offensive operations. Not just strikes on Kharkiv and Zaporizhia regions, but also movement toward Kiev. That's why, both according to the Constitution and from a military and political logic, we are not going to give up these territories and we will continue to work effectively. Why? Because even to take some positions, well, first of all, the enemy has no chance in Donetsk. But even if we talk about what would need to be done, they'd have to lose 500,000 or even 1 million people there. Because the lion's share of those 1,000 or more casualties daily is in the Donetsk direction. So, to break through these fortifications, Russia would need colossal resources. They don't have those today. That's why Putin's model is, let's supposedly take territory, they enter it without a fight, and then none of the obligations they sign will be fulfilled, because they have a free hand to do whatever they want. The president sees this mistake. Obviously, according to the Constitution, he doesn't have the right, and also, in terms of ensuring our security and our combat positions at the front.